When Peter Mayhew passed away in 2019, his quiet home in Boyd, Texas, became a place of both reverence and silence. The tall man with the gentle presence had lived there for years, tucked away from the chaos of Hollywood. After his death, the house remained on the market for some time before eventually being purchased by a young couple who wanted space, privacy, and a bit of history attached to their home. At first, it seemed like the perfect property. The sprawling yard, the high ceilings, and the sense of calm that clung to the walls made it feel like a sanctuary. But slowly, little things began to unsettle them. They would hear the creak of footsteps in the hallway at night, long, heavy, and measured, as if made by someone impossibly tall. Doors that they swore they had closed would be found ajar in the morning. Sometimes, they'd wake up to the sound of deep, labored breathing just beyond their bedroom door, only to find nothing there. One evening, while sorting through old boxes left in the garage, they found a collection of memorabilia Peter had never taken with him. A worn walking cane, a stack of scripts, and a giant pair of boots that seemed almost comically large until you remembered the man who once filled them. After that discovery, the disturbances escalated. Lights flickered. The family dog refused to go near the garage. At night, the couple often woke to the sound of something dragging across the wooden floor, as though those boots were moving on their own. Neighbors whispered that Peter had loved his home deeply, that it was his retreat from the world. Some said it wasn't anger holding him there, but attachment. Yet, to the new owners, the feeling in the house wasn't comforting, it was heavy, suffocating, as though the very air carried the weight of his presence. The final straw came one night when the husband awoke to the feeling of someone standing over him. In the dim glow of the moonlight through the window, he swore he saw the outline of a figure impossibly tall, shoulders hunched, as if trying to fit into a space too small for its frame. When he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the sound of slow, steady breathing echoing in the room. Within weeks, the couple put the house back on the market. They left quickly, taking only their essentials, refusing even to return for the furniture. The house sits quietly again, waiting for its next set of owners. And at night, neighbors claim, if the wind is still, you can hear the same heavy footsteps moving through the halls, measured, deliberate, as though Peter Mayhew never truly left the home he cherished. The new owners, Aaron and Matthew, tried to convince themselves that what they were experiencing were simply the growing pains of adjusting to a new home. They had left behind a cramped apartment in Dallas for this sprawling property, a home filled with character and memories. It made sense, they told each other, that an old place would creak, that strange drafts might carry noises across the floors. But no matter how often they rationalized, the unease grew heavier with every week they lived there. The layout of the house was unusual: long hallways, ceilings that rose much higher than expected, almost cathedral-like in places. Even in daylight, the rooms seemed to carry shadows that clung to the corners. Erin often caught herself staring down the hallway, waiting for something to move in her peripheral vision. She described it as the sense of being observed from above, though she couldn't explain why. At night, the unease turned into something sharper. Matthew was the first to admit he had heard it: the breathing. Slow, deep, and resonant, as if someone was standing only a few feet away. At times, he would sit up in bed, holding his breath just to be sure it wasn't his imagination. Erin, though skeptical at first, was shaken awake one night when she felt the weight of the mattress dip, as though someone enormous had sat down on the edge of the bed. The garage became the heart of their dread. Since discovering the box of Peter's belongings, neither of them liked entering it. The boots, resting by the wall, seemed to shift positions subtly from one day to the next. Matthew once insisted he had lined them neatly against the wall, only to find them angled toward the door the next morning. Erin refused to touch them at all, saying they held too much of him. She swore the air in the garage was thicker, carrying an odd metallic tang, like rust or blood, though she could never trace the source. Neighbors told stories in hushed voices. Many remembered Peter as a gentle giant, always kind, always welcoming. But more than one neighbor admitted that his connection to the house was profound. He had considered it his sanctuary, a private fortress where the outside world could never intrude. If he loved it that much, one elderly man remarked to Matthew, "Don't be surprised if part of him never left." One evening, Matthew returned home late from work. The house was quiet, Aaron already asleep upstairs. As he locked the front door, he heard something shift above him, slow, deliberate footfalls crossing the upstairs landing. He froze. The sound wasn't Aaron's light step, but something far heavier, deliberate, echoing through the beams. Heart racing, he called out her name, but there was no answer. When he finally climbed the stairs, he found Aaron fast asleep. But in the hallway outside their bedroom, a single long shadow stretched across the carpet, impossibly tall, bending unnaturally at the ceiling as though pressed into a space too small to contain it. Matthew turned the light on and the shadow dissolved instantly. After that night, they stopped inviting friends over. The house felt too heavy, too charged, as though any outside presence might trigger something worse. Aaron kept curtains drawn at all hours, claiming she saw a figure move past the windows from inside when she was outside in the garden. The couple began speaking less, as though putting their experiences into words would only make them more real. The unease reached a breaking point one rainy night. Power flickered across the property, plunging the house into deep silence. With only a flashlight, Matthew went into the garage to check the breaker. The beam of light caught the boots again, but this time, they weren't where he remembered. They were standing in the center of the floor, pointed toward him, glistening slightly as though someone had just walked in from the rain. He dropped the flashlight. In the darkness that followed, he swore he heard it. That deep, ragged breathing, so close it felt like it vibrated through his chest. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Matthew stood frozen in the dark garage, every muscle in his body tightening against the instinct to run. The air felt heavier there than anywhere else in the house, thick with moisture and the faint odor of wet concrete. He fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers brushing against the cold cement floor, but in that silence broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat, he realized he was not alone. The breathing was there again, low, guttural, steady. It was not the shallow rise and fall of lungs at rest. It was deliberate, as though each inhale and exhale carried weight, echoing inside the narrow garage like the sound of someone forcing air through a hollow chest. When his hand finally closed around the flashlight, he dared not switch it on immediately. Instead, he crouched low, straining to listen. The sound was moving, slow and methodical, as though circling him in the dark. He flicked the beam upward, the light slicing across the walls, catching metal tools, the sheen of the car, the outline of old cardboard boxes stacked in corners. The boots, those massive, leather boots, stood upright in the middle of the garage floor. Water pooled around them as though someone had just trudged in from a storm. His first instinct was to grab them and toss them outside, but the weight of dread rooted him to the spot. Upstairs, Aaron stirred awake to the faint sound of movement below. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m., and for a moment she assumed Matthew was rummaging around for something. But as she lay there listening, the sound didn't match the clatter of someone searching for tools or adjusting the breaker. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, long, heavy strides that seemed to drag slightly at the end, as though whoever walked had to bend under the weight of their own frame. She sat up in bed, her skin prickling, every hair on her arms rising as the footsteps grew louder and then seemed to stop directly beneath the bedroom. When Matthew finally staggered back inside, pale and shaken, Aaron saw immediately that something had changed in him. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted around the room, refusing to meet hers. He told her in a hushed, unsteady voice what had happened in the garage, about the boots, the water, the breathing so close he could feel it inside his chest. Aaron tried to dismiss it, tried to tell him it was exhaustion or stress, but the hollow look on his face silenced her. The following days blurred together in a fog of unease. The house became impossible to ignore. Doors slammed on their own, echoing through the hallways with a force that rattled the windows. Shadows shifted in corners where no light should have cast them. More than once, Aaron thought she saw movement reflected in the glass of picture frame, something tall, stooping, always at the edge of sight. She stopped going into the garage altogether, leaving it locked, though sometimes at night she could hear noises coming from within. A scrape, a dragging sound, as if something large was being pulled across the concrete. One evening, as the couple sat in the living room trying to distract themselves with the television, the screen flickered violently before shutting off completely. The room went dark, save for the dim light from a lamp in the corner. Erin turned her head instinctively toward the hallway and froze. There, at the far end, was the silhouette of a figure. It stretched unnaturally tall, so tall that its head seemed pressed against the ceiling, its shoulders hunched forward to fit within the confines of the corridor. The figure stood completely still, blocking out the faint glow of the kitchen light behind it. Mayhew whispered her name, but before Erin could respond, the lamp beside them went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The only thing left was the sound: deep, resonant breathing, slow and steady, moving closer with every passing second. The darkness seemed to stretch out endlessly in that moment, thick and suffocating, as though the very walls of the house were closing in on them. Erin gripped Mayhew's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The sound of breathing was closer now, filling the silence with its slow, deliberate rhythm. It didn't sound strained or tired, but purposeful, as if whoever or whatever was making it wanted them to know they weren't alone. Mayhew forced himself to reach across the couch, fumbling for his phone. The screen flared briefly in the darkness, throwing pale blue light into the room. In that fractured glow, Erin swore she saw something impossibly tall shift in the hallway, just beyond the circle of light. A shoulder bent, a long arm brushing the wall. Then the light died as quickly as it appeared, the phone slipping from Mayhew's trembling hands to the floor with a muffled thud. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy, measured, each one sinking into the wooden floorboards with a weight no ordinary man could possess. They came closer, echoing through the room, then stopped just short of where the couple sat frozen. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. They both sat there, hardly daring to breathe, listening, waiting. Erin's chest ached from holding her breath, but she was terrified that even the smallest exhale might draw its attention. When the lamp flickered back on, the room was empty. The hallway stretched out quietly, the kitchen beyond glowing faintly in the distance. But the weight in the air lingered, as though the figure hadn't gone, it had simply stepped out of sight. That night neither of them slept. They lay awake in bed, listening to the groans of the house and the restless whisper of wind outside. But somewhere past 3 in the morning, Mayhew stirred and sat up suddenly. He had heard it again, but not inside the house this time. It came from just beyond the window, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the gravel driveway. He crept to the curtains and pulled them back only an inch. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the dim silver wash of moonlight, something tall moved across the yard. Its shadow stretched unnaturally across the ground, long arms swaying at its sides, head tilted downward as though searching for something. It was barefoot, or at least he thought it was. Each step sank into the earth without a sound. But what struck him most was the way it carried itself, hunched slightly, as though the world itself was too small to contain it. Mayhew yanked the curtain closed and staggered back. Erin, now wide awake, asked what he had seen, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. He only shook his head, muttering that it was nothing, though his voice was unconvincing even to himself. The following day, they noticed small changes throughout the house. Picture frames tilted at odd angles, the smell of damp earth clinging to the living room carpet, though neither of them had tracked in mud. And in the garage, though they had locked the door and avoided it for weeks, the boots were gone. That discovery broke Erin. She stood in the doorway, staring at the empty spot on the concrete floor where they had stood, her hands trembling at her sides. "They don't just disappear," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They can't just disappear." Mayhew tried to reassure her, though he felt the same dread tightening around his chest. They searched the garage from corner to corner, moved boxes, checked closets, even combed through the backyard, but the boots were nowhere to be found. That night, as they sat in silence, both too exhausted to argue, they heard a sound from upstairs, a slow, deliberate dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floorboards. When Matthew climbed the stairs with a flashlight, he froze halfway up. At the top of the landing, standing perfectly upright, were the boots. They were facing him, toes angled directly down the staircase. And though no one was wearing them, each time the drag echoed through the house, they shifted slightly forward as if someone invisible was inside, trying to walk. Matthew stood frozen on the stairs, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The boots at the top of the landing loomed in the narrow beam, their leather glistening faintly, as though wet again. Each time the dragging sound echoed, the boots shifted, inching closer, the hollow thud of their soles pressing against the old wood. He could not see anyone in them, yet the space above them seemed distorted, filled by a presence too large for the hallway, as if someone impossibly tall were stooping low, just out of sight. "Don't go up there," Erin whispered from below, her voice strained with terror. But Matthew was locked in place, his mind grasping for some logical explanation. Perhaps someone had broken in. Perhaps a cruel prank was unfolding, but deep down he knew it wasn't that. The house had been empty when they bought it, but never silent. It had always carried the weight of someone else. The boots shifted again, this time turning slightly, as though preparing to walk down toward him. That was enough. Matthew stumbled back, nearly falling, and the two of them fled out the front door into the cool night air. They stood barefoot on the gravel, breathing hard, staring up at the darkened windows of the house. The lights flickered once, as if the house itself were breathing with them, and then went still. They didn't return that night. Instead, they drove to a nearby motel, where the cheap fluorescent lights and hum of traffic outside were a strange comfort. For the first time in months, Erin managed to sleep. But Matthew lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the building reminding him of the house they had abandoned. The next morning, when they returned to gather some essentials, the boots were gone again. No trace of them remained. But the house carried a smell, now damp earth and something faintly metallic. Erin refused to go inside. She waited on the porch, pacing, whispering prayers under her breath, while Matthew moved quickly through the rooms, throwing clothes into bags. In the bedroom, he froze. Across the mirror above the dresser, fog had formed in uneven patches, though the glass was cool to the touch. In the center, smeared as if by an enormous hand, was a single long streak, dragged downward. That was the end for them. They packed only what they could carry and left, never spending another night there. Within a week, the house was on the market again. The realtor never asked why, they rarely do when it comes to houses with history. Months later, when new buyers came to tour the property, the house appeared quiet, undisturbed. But neighbors said the couple didn't stay long during the showing. They had gone into the upstairs hallway and heard something long, heavy breathing that made the floorboards hum. They left abruptly, never to return. The house still stands, quiet and waiting, tucked away in Boyd, Texas. At night, the neighbors say, you can sometimes see a tall shadow pass across the upstairs windows, moving too slowly, too heavily to belong to anyone living. And if the wind dies down and the air is still, you can hear it, those long, deliberate footsteps, echoing across the empty house as though Peter Mayhew himself never truly left his sanctuary. The house still stands, quiet and waiting, tucked away in Boyd, Texas. At night, the neighbors say, you can sometimes see a tall shadow pass across the upstairs windows, moving too slowly, too heavily to belong to anyone living. And if the wind dies down and the air is still, you can hear it, those long, deliberate footsteps, echoing across the empty halls as though Peter Mayhew himself never truly left his sanctuary. Some claim it isn't anger that holds him there, but devotion. He had loved the property deeply, retreating to its quiet corners when the world became too demanding. They say his presence lingers not to harm, but because he never wanted to leave. Yet for those who step inside, that devotion feels nothing like comfort. It is weight, pressure, a constant reminder that they are trespassers in a space that still belongs to someone else. One neighbor swore he saw the garage light flick on at 3 in the morning, even though the house had been empty for months. Another said that while walking past with his dog, the animal froze, tail tucked, eyes fixed on the upstairs window, refusing to move until dragged away. and on more than one occasion, passers-by reported seeing shapes pressed against the curtain's shadows too tall, too hunched, lingering silently before disappearing back into the darkness. The house goes on the market every few years, bought by families hopeful for peace and quiet, only to be abandoned again. The story circulates quietly in town. The breathing, the footsteps, the boots that appear and vanish. No one can prove it, yet no one stays long enough to deny it either. And so the house waits, its rooms heavy with silence, its windows watching the world outside. At night, when the moon is high and the Texas air is still, it feels less like an abandoned property and more like a watchtower guarded by something too large, too present, to ever be gone. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?